this passage. If you haven't read Iron John, and you're a man interested in, you know, becoming a better man and understanding how we got here and where it all comes from, definitely pick up a copy. It's an incredible journey, and it's a little dated because it was written in the late 80s, but ultimately it's talking about timeless principles that are pre everything. Like, it's pre-Christian. It's Grimm's brothers fairy tales that have no known origin date. They are like before antiquity. That's how old the story itself of Iron John is. In Scandinavia, it was called Iron Hans. Anyhow, so the part I want to highlight is the discussion of iron and copper. And this is relevant because it's in the modern context, it's highlighting the same problem of what we nowadays call nice guy syndrome or codependency in adults, in men specifically. And the metaphor of copper versus iron refers to the shift from childhood to warriorhood and this initiation elementally, whereas copper is symbolic of a conducting metal, and iron is not conducting like copper is. So iron is like the warrior, and I'll share more from the reading about why that is so. But basically, in a nutshell, the metaphor is that when your inner child is trapped between a mother and a father who are fighting, or if there's turbulence in the home, the child will take on a quality of copper. It's like a conducting metal, so it'll conduct the conflict that's in the air, and it'll ground it into the earth. And if that pattern isn't changed, transformed, the child will carry that pattern into adulthood, and they will tend towards being a people pleaser or codependent, which is basically the core wound that says, I'm okay if you're okay, and I'm only okay if you're okay. So you can see how that relates to nice guy syndrome. And what I want to say before I get into the reading, because I'm going to read a chapter about iron versus copper, is when I coach men and women in marriages, in the preventing divorce coaching, what I often come to, if there's a chronic pattern of fighting, is that, you know, the most evolved thing to do in facing a conflict is to isolate the problem and separate it from the person. And that's using discernment to, rather than looking over the problem at the other person and pointing a finger, it's to pivot, just this little pivot, so that you're shoulder to shoulder with the other person and you're looking at the problem together and saying, let's solve this together. Terrence Real has a great line around the relational repair wisdom inside of relationships. And he says, instead of getting into the trap of trying to decide who's right and who's wrong, why don't we instead say, who cares? We're together. And so going from this adversarial position of blame and finger pointing to come shoulder to shoulder and say, there's the problem, let's work on it together, and where's my part in it? You know, like what can I do differently? What can I own and take ownership of and lead into that storm, just like a buffalo will run toward a snowstorm, because he knows that that's the shortest route through the storm, is to actually face it and confront the conflict rather than avoid it, have that uncomfortable conversation. So that is the nature of the warrior. The warrior turns toward chaos turns toward the pain or turns towards the conflict, and bows in service and certainty of like facing that, owning up to it. Robert Bly writes about iron versus copper. He says, we notice that the soldiers in our story, when they are running alongside Iron John's horse, are clothed in iron. Iron belongs to Mars and Aries. Iron was believed to be related to blood because of the red hiding inside iron. The ancients distinguished between two sorts of iron: magnetic iron, which is associated with sky gods and has fallen from the heavens, and ordinary iron, which is associated with earthly dark gods who pursue and kill the solar god Osiris. Sounds like ancient Egyptian stuff. In astrology, iron governs the planet Mars, the red planet. Iron is often considered lucky, especially when found on the road. Horseshoes can be used as protection against evil, and nails are set into cradles to protect infants, or into beds to protect women in childbirth. Scissors may also be hidden in the bed also. William Blake associated iron with intellect and with spiritual warfare. We notice in fairy tales that the energy of the benevolent father spirit appears at times in the form of small men dressed in iron. When the boy in our story brings iron into the battlefield with him, he brings a great array of luck and helpful powers: horseshoes, magnetic iron, blood, the planet Mars, sky gods, the father spirit, and intellectual fight. So far in this chapter, Bly links warriorhood with self-sacrifice and service to the king, to intellectual combat and clean fighting in marriage. That's the real thing here. David Dita calls it making flowery combat. When there's tension in a man-woman relationship, how to fight clean is to turn it into flowery combat. But Bly talks about the sharpness of the Vajra sword, and the Vajra sword should move in such a way as to cut apart what has been inappropriately joined. The Vajra sword will cut apart what has been inappropriately joined. I love that Robert Bly is talking about this back in the 80s, because inside of the training around somatic transformation and neuroscience, we now know and have language to describe trauma bonding, when two things become joined or bonded, and there's a neural pathway that links them up. This is common in addictions. How many people who are addicted to cigarettes also have an addiction to coffee? I remember having those addictions, and every time I had a coffee, I wanted to have a cigarette, because they had been paired in my neurobiology. So bringing that sword and uncoupling that trauma bonding is a powerful slice. So let's get back into this. The sword has done its work, and the Logos knife has cut well when we find ourselves less needy and more ready to enter the pairs of opposites. Some of the pairs of opposites are light and dark, limited and unlimited, male and female, and resting versus moving, and so on. So what if we feel too young to inhabit the dangerous space between male and female? What if we don't like the fierce tension between straight and crooked, and don't feel up to so many opposites? The child in a messed up family may feel a ghastly tension between the addicted parent and the clean parent, between the cold of the angry father and the heat of the loving mother. or between the cold of the furious mother and the heat of the sorrowing father. In such a situation, it's relatively easy to give up on iron work and take up the copper work. So this is where he's getting into what copper means in the copper versus iron comparison. By the way, drop some love on this post or comment if you're hearing anything in it. So in copper work, a child can easily become a professional bridge, which is a conductor made of that good conducting metal, copper. A man's copper work begins early by placing one hand on his father's wrathful chest and the other hand on the earth. Or perhaps he places one hand on his mother's anguished heart and the other on the earth. Or one hand on an adult's isolated head and the other on the earth. The boy who becomes a conductor values himself for the complicated current that runs through his body, for his ability to conduct wrath, conduct wrath to the ground by a quiet reply, for the self-sacrificing stretching out of his arms to touch each pole. Many of us know this sensation of conduction from early childhood. The mother and father talk to each other through the child. The shame of the alcoholic father, for example, goes through our body heading east, and the anxiety from the dependent mother goes through our body heading west. Fury and contempt pass each other, meeting somewhere in the son's or daughter's chest. If the child is a boy, the intense isolation of the father can run through him with little resistance. Copper is such a good conductor that the boy doesn't heat up. If a man has become copper as a boy, he will likely continue working with that metal when grown up. Bly gets into so many examples here, like this statement: "My father never stood up to my mother, and I'm still angry about that." Hundreds of men have spoken that sentence at gatherings. Sometimes all that would have been necessary would have been for the father to stand up for his boundaries or for the limits of verbal abuse and say simply, "Enough." The more a man agrees to be copper, the more he becomes neither dead or alive, but a third thing, an amorphous, demasculated, half-alive psychic conductor. Conducting large amounts of charm and niceness is also dangerous. Excessive amounts of copper is an occupational hazard for ministers, therapists, priests, resembling the habits of ingesting lead that some factory workers endure. I think I see it a lot in any of the helping professions where vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue or burnout happens. Really, this is all just about the problem of merging, and that is what copper is about, is losing your sense of autonomy, losing your sense of sovereignty, which can only come when there's a healthy, intact warrior that can draw boundaries, set limits, and say, what's the difference between me and you? And that ultimately always goes back to our primary relationship, the primal bond of our first loves, which is our mother and father. And this is pivotal because this, even though this stuff seems deep and maybe irrelevant, when you really unpack the layers of why divorce happens or why marriages fail, it's because of this lost knowledge of not just copper and iron, but how to have a clean fight in a marriage that ends in progress rather than a trauma vortex. what I mean by trauma vortex is when you are regressing into your immature little twit of your wounded inner child, and your partner is also regressing into their immature little twit. What happens is their storm and your storm overlap, and that creates a trauma vortex, which is always like a downhill spiral or a toilet bowl that's going nowhere. And if a relationship becomes unclear because of this muddied waters of conflicts that have not been cleared, then that will eventually unravel and lead to divorce. So learning how to do conflict well, how to hold your center, how to not collapse, how to own your shit, and create a container for transformation so that love can win. These are all essential skills for the long game of marriage and happily ever after, which doesn't get written about enough in the fairy tales. But that's what I wanted to share today, because it's been a long time since I got on Facebook and did a live. I've been doing more on Instagram, so you could also look for me there. And I've also started a YouTube channel. So if you want to see some more of me going on about all the tactics and strategies to master a relationship, transform fighting into fucking, and then check out that if you do get the chance. Again, if you heard anything good in this video, please smash on the hearts and drop me some love. Thanks for being part of my ecosystem today. Sending big love. Bye for now.